Hi, everyone. We are especially grateful to those of you for whom it's quite late in your home countries. Thank you for staying with us. We're thrilled that we've had a great number of participants stay with us throughout the 2 days. And as I invite the final set of panelists to come and turn their cameras on and join us, let me just say, like we've been hearing from all of our colleagues who have been presenting, this has just been such an enormously learned set of discussions. The creative solutions from technical levers that can be used ex ante to thinking institutionally about what the right set of leaders for the next pandemic ought to be. It's just been really wonderful. And the engagement in the conversation and the Q&A and chat has also been really helpful. We are planning to capture all of that, not just in terms of the video that will be made available, which will include the chat conversations and the Q&A, but Professor Sun and I are planning to publish a volume with these incredible contributors so that we can capture these proposals and make them available as soon as possible in a number of different forms. So let's jump right into the final panel. We have 4 amazing speakers, and now we're going to be doing a closer look regionally at what are the specific challenges and opportunities in China, India, and Latin America. Let's begin with Kashish Aneja. Kashish is, we're proud to call him a graduate of our LLM program at Georgetown Law. He is currently back at Georgetown Law this semester. He's a consultant with the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health. Kashish.
Thank you, Madhavi. Thank you so much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'll just quickly share my screen. Yeah, I don't have much slides, but okay, so my topic for the day is India, the world's pharmacy, failing to deliver IP and beyond. And this year started with the wealthy countries hoarding vaccines, and many wealthy countries made major deals with multiple companies. The United States and the European Union, for example, advance purchased enough to vaccinate their populations 3 times over. While this was happening, India, which is home to the Serum Institute of India and Bharat Biotech, which manufactures the indigenously developed Covaxin, exported close to 60 million doses of vaccines, supporting a large number of its neighbors and enough to inoculate the entire population of Bhutan with the first round of vaccines. So initially, India positioned itself as the world's pharmacy, but it clearly failed to deliver. The Serum Institute of India failed to meet its obligations to COVAX after the Indian government imposed export restrictions later in March this year. Today, I'll talk about the events that unfolded in India that possibly contributed to the global shortage of the COVID-19 vaccines. And I'll start with the poorly planned procurement that happened in India, followed by the delayed regulatory approvals and the regulatory hurdles that affected the entire vaccination process, followed by the vaccine policy, which resulted in differential pricing as well as chaos and uncertainty in India. Briefly talking about the shortage of raw materials, and then finally intellectual property issues, compulsory licensing, and voluntary licensing. So, one sec. Yeah. So starting with the procurement issues, one of the first events that led to the shortage of vaccines in India was the lack of foreseeing the obvious in procuring orders. India has a vaccine eligible population of 18 years and above of close to 1 billion, whereas the Indian government had ordered just over 66 million vaccines until March 2021, out of which a substantial number of them were exported. Now, with these numbers, it was clear that in March, April 2021, when India was facing its worst COVID outbreak, the country needed to prioritize domestic procurement, including permitting foreign vaccine manufacturers to enter the Indian market. But, and this leads me to the second point of regulatory approvals, besides the poorly planned procurement, delayed regulatory approvals and regulatory hurdles have also affected vaccines access in the country. Until April 2021, the Indian government required bridging trials in India. AstraZeneca's Covishield, produced by Serum Institute of India, and Covaxin, produced by the Bharat Biotech, were the only 2 vaccines approved in India. Pfizer had submitted its application for emergency use authorization in December 2020. However, in Feb 2021, its it withdrew its application after failing to meet the drug regulators' demand for bridging trials. Pfizer had sought an exception, citing approvals it had received in the US, UK, and Germany, but that was rejected by the Indian regulatory. It was only in April 13th, 2021, that the Indian government agreed to grant the emergency use authorization for COVID-19 vaccines, which were developed and manufactured in foreign countries, and granted emergency approvals for restricted use by regulators in the US, EU, UK, Japan, or those which were listed in the WHO's emergency use listing. So foreign-produced COVID-19 vaccines, April onwards, that were seeking EUA in India were required to conduct post-approval parallel bridging clinical trials, subject to the time limit of 30 days of such approval. And recently, in September 2021, the Union Government of India declared that they declined to buy the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And the decision came in light of the increasing domestic manufacturing output and the expensive prices of these foreign vaccines. Another reason behind such a decision was a demand for sovereign immunity. Moving to the third issue and the third event, which had a rippling effect throughout the world, was the vaccine policy in India. A major impediment in vaccine accessibility in the country was a revised national procurement and distribution policy that was introduced by the central government in May 2021. The revised policy shifted the responsibility of vaccine procurement from the central to the state government, and India has 36 states and territories. So the center were to continue providing free vaccines to persons over the age of 45 years, whereas the state governments were to be responsible for procuring vaccines and immunizing people aged 18 to 44 years. Thus, the revised policy, out of the blue, shifted the entire burden of vaccinating the 18 to 44 aged population onto the respective state governments. And in the process, it created multiple buyers in a limited market. And in a time when there was significant shortage of vaccines in the country due to lack of timely procurement by the central government. So this revised policy also resulted in differential pricing. And the Supreme Court of India back in April-May had termed this revised vaccine policy as prima facie arbitrary and irrational and detrimental to the right to health, and observed that differential vaccine pricing may cause inequalities and exclusion of the marginalized sections of society. I'll just pause here and talk briefly about the role of Supreme Court during the pandemic in India, which also has important implications in terms of the global vaccine supply. And the Supreme Court played a role which is known as dialogical review. And this came at a time when the country was facing one of the worst pandemic outbreaks during the second wave. And since the court could not have entered the policy-making role, respecting the separation of powers, it chose to exercise the dialogical review, wherein it established an open court dialogue between the executive branch of the government and the public. It asked specific pointed questions regarding the government's public health response and preparedness, including questions on compulsory licensing, voluntary licensing, and tech transfers. So the court highlighted that this vaccine policy would potentially lead to chaos and uncertainty, and that did happen. While the center negotiated lower vaccine procurement prices for itself, higher prices were negotiated for state governments and private hospitals. This sudden passing down of responsibility, combined with shortage of domestically produced vaccines, namely Covishield and Covaxin, state governments were compelled to approach international manufacturers and issue global tenders for vaccines. However, many state governments which had attempted to negotiate directly with these foreign manufacturers had largely been unsuccessful, as foreign manufacturers were not willing to negotiate and enter into a dialogue with the state governments, and they preferred dealing with the central government. So upon receiving severe criticism and with the Supreme Court's intervention, the central government in May adopted a centralized procurement and a decentralized distribution. So you can imagine the lack of cooperative federalism between the center and the state, and the issues connected with the revised vaccine procurement and distribution policy hindered the entire vaccination program. And all this happened during a period when we already had shortage of oxygen and so on and so forth during the second wave of the outbreak. So adding to all this, we had a huge shortage of raw material. And in April 2021, the Indian vaccine manufacturers reporting shortage of raw materials after the United States introduced a ban on raw material exports. The constraint of raw and packaging materials, which were crucial in the manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines, negatively affected the vaccine production and stalled the immunization in India. Finally, the intellectual property related issues, including the compulsory licensing and the voluntary licensing. As we all have been discussing, in October 2020, a joint proposal was put forth at the World Trade Organization by India and South Africa, suggesting a waiver of certain IP rights in context of COVID-19. Now, it is extremely ironic how the Indian government did not consider compulsory licensing and voluntary licensing as a viable option back home for a long duration, particularly in context of its indigenously developed vaccine Covaxin. And over here, Covaxin is quite uniquely placed because the entire process of developing Covaxin involved a public-private partnership between the Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR, which is a government agency, and the Bharat Biotech International Company. So the IP rights over Covaxin are shared between ICMR, the government agency, and the Bharat Biotech private company. Thus, it is presumed that the center has substantial control over the intellectual property and technological know-how of Covaxin. But despite this fact, the government for a long period did not issue voluntary licenses or exerted its power under the Patents Act to allow government use of the vaccine. In fact, in May 2021, one of the government think tank known as Niti Aayog, in a press statement indicated that India is not planning to issue any compulsory licenses for COVID-19 vaccines, and that it did not find compulsory licensing an attractive option. However, in July 2021, there was a contradiction in the ideologies in the government when the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce, in its report on the review of IP regime during COVID-19, stated that during a national health emergency such as the present one, issuing of compulsory licensing should be considered to tackle the inadequacy in availability and accessibility of COVID-19 vaccines. So, while internationally, the Indian government propagated for IP waivers, back home, it chose not to do the same for a long period of time. But it was only later in May that the government decided to facilitate active partnerships between Bharat Biotechs and 3 other public sector entities to enhance the production of Covaxin. So it was only in May when, after much pressure from the Supreme Court as well as the public pressure, that the government identified these public sector undertakings, which were equipped to manufacture vaccines, and they established this partnership between Bharat Biotech and these PSUs to produce Covaxin. And recently, in August 2021, the Union Health Minister announced that the technology transfer of Covaxin production had begun to some of the state government vaccines manufacturing units. So, as you can see, the events during the first phase of the year from January to May were drastically different from what followed after May, including initiating voluntary licensing, initiating tech transfers, and so on and so forth. So, as of today, in India, over 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines have been administered and export bans are being lifted. In October, the Indian government already started exporting vaccines to its neighbors, Iran, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Nepal, and it is expected that the Serum Institute of India will soon start its exports to COVAX. I believe India is a very classic case study of how domestic events, both IP and non-IP related, impact global vaccine supply, particularly for the global South. It will be extremely interesting to observe the events unfolding in India over the next couple of months as it tries to regain its position as the pharmacy of the world. Thank you. Over to you, Madhavi.
Thank you so much, Kashish. That was just incredibly interesting and very disappointing, because India has been such a leader, and to see that failure and the effects in India and beyond. Thank you. Let's move now to, we are so delighted to have Carlos Correa, the Executive Director of the South Center with us. And Carlos, you're up. Let's see, are you with us here?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you very much in the first place for the invitation to this very interesting discussion. So I will address the issue of the structure of the global vaccine industry, and I will address in particular 2 questions. One is whether the structure of industry may change after COVID-19. And secondly, what the role for developing countries could be if such a change occurs. So let me describe a number of features of the global vaccine industry. I will base my presentation largely on a paper published recently in September this year by the South Center. The research paper 134 was produced by Professor Lobo from Spain, and he studied in depth the situation of the vaccine industry. So let me describe some of the features of this industry. Well, in the first place, it's important to recognize that vaccines play an important role for public health. More than 20 life-threatening diseases are addressed through vaccines. Just recall the case of the eradication of smallpox, of the major reduction in relation to polio, more than 99%. So vaccines play a very important role in terms of public health, and therefore to have a solid industry which is able to provide vaccines around the world and to overcome the problems of inequity that were already mentioned in this webinar are crucial for all. Secondly, it is known that there has been historically an underinvestment in research and development in the area of vaccines. So there may be very different reasons for this. One reason is that in this area, as it is also the case generally for pharmaceuticals, there is a significant attrition rate. So this means that not all candidates for a vaccine actually are put in the market because many of them failed in the process of development of clinical studies. The average time for developing vaccine in the past was 10 years, 10.7 years, so quite a long term. And certainly pharmaceutical companies have, in some cases, more profitable options, such as in the case of chronic diseases in which they can provide medicines for the lifetime of a patient, and not necessarily to cure them, but to provide medicine for a long time. So one of the arguments in order to explain this underinvestment of research development has typically been the fact that the industry, it is said by some, has a low profitability. There isn't really too much evidence about this, at least in the pre-COVID era, about profitability. There was a study, but many years ago by Professor Scherer, one of the greatest industrial economists in the last century, I would say. And he found that unlike what was generally thought, the vaccine industry was quite profitable. So he found a 56.4% price cost margin in the vaccine industry compared to 28% price cost margin generally for manufacturing industry. And what we have seen in the COVID-19 era, for instance, with the huge benefits, profits made by Pfizer, is that this industry can actually be very profitable. So a third feature that I would like to refer to is the fact that although we talk in general about vaccines, as it is already quite known now because of COVID-19, there are different techniques in order to produce vaccines. There are some techniques which may be called conventional, such as the use of attenuated or inactivated virus. And there are more modern technologies, such as the subunit technology or the messenger RNA technology, which has had a lot of impact in COVID-19. There are important differences in the methodologies used. There is, for instance, the case of those vaccines, the conventional type of vaccines, there is quite uncertainty in production. There is variability in the yields because there is, among other things, the risk of contamination. In the case of mRNA technology, the newest technology, there are many advantages. In particular, the fact that once the active ingredient is produced, it can be scaled up as a chemical compound. So production can be faster, and then the volume of production can also be greater as compared to the other technologies. So one question that many experts and those industry are making now is whether the mRNA technology may in fact replace the so-called conventional technologies. And so there's something which is still unclear, but one of the barriers for the dissemination of this newest technology is the fact that the mRNA is fragile and therefore there is a need of ultra cold chain storage, and therefore this is one limitation in particular for the use of vaccines in some countries where these facilities may not exist. So, of course, another important feature in the vaccine industry relates to the level of investment which is needed in order to establish a plant, because this clearly means that depending on the level of investment, so you have a high or low barriers of entry. In the case of vaccines production, there are many different estimates. For instance, a study that was done by UNIDO and the World Health Organization in connection with a possible establishment of vaccine production in Africa. They estimated the cost between $60 million and $130 million. There was a recent statement by the CEO of Biovac, the South African company, who said that establishing a plant may cost between $200 and $350 million. There are studies that indicate that even higher investment may be needed. So there isn't clear information about this, but it is quite evident that the cost of establishing a vaccine plant is much higher than establishing a plant for medicines based on chemical synthesis. So here there is an additional barrier, in particular for developing countries to enter in this field. So coming to the production function of the vaccine industry, quite clearly it is a quite complicated function. Certainly economies of scale are important. So this means that the average cost of the unit will decrease as volume grows. So that's an important feature in the industry. Some of the plants which produce vaccines are quite specialized. They are not very flexible to move into production of other vaccines. And one particular element is the complexity of the supply chains of inputs for production of vaccines. According to different studies, not least that 90 or more inputs are needed in order to produce vaccines. And this one issue has also been raised in the context of discussion about intellectual property and the waiver in WTO. When reference is made to patents in connection with vaccines, it's important to bear in mind that these patents may refer not only to the vaccine as such, but to some of the many inputs that are integrated in the production of a vaccine. So all these features have led, of course, I'm making right now a summary, but these features and others of the vaccine industry have led to a very concentrated sector, a very concentrated industry, an industry of very high concentration. So in some cases, for instance, for one particular vaccines, there is just one provider or one or two providers. In fact, some studies have called the vaccine industry a club in which you have pre-COVID-19 four Western companies dominating about 80% of the market. So clear oligopoly, controlled by big companies, by multinational companies. Although there is a kind of division of work, because multinational companies, they have the resources in order to carry out the clinical studies or production, but innovation is coming mostly from small biotech companies, not from the big companies themselves. So another important issue relates to technology. This was mentioned during this webinar. Certainly patents are relevant in the area of vaccines. For instance, Moderna has got more than 200 patents in relation to the mRNA technology, which was not developed, in fact, by Moderna, but by scientists in different universities. But one recurrent argument, in particular, when the expansion of the manufacturing capacity has been referred to in many debates, is about the importance of know-how. So beyond what can be described in a patent, in the production of vaccines, trade secrets, know-how play an important role. So one question is whether this is an obstacle that may be overcome. For instance, if there is a need, as I think there is a need to expand manufacturing capacity. So there is some evidence that even for mRNA technology, for messenger RNA technology, recreating the know-how takes time, but it's not impossible. For instance, in this field, we have at least two institutions in China and in Thailand have developed independently without receiving transfer of technology, without getting technology from Moderna or Pfizer. They have been able to develop their own messenger RNA technology, which are now in process. The case of the Chinese messenger RNA vaccine clinical trials are being carried out. So this is something which is more specific also to the vaccine industry as compared to the pharmaceutical industry, which relies on the production of chemical synthesis. So now coming to the questions. To what extent COVID-19 has changed this landscape? Well, one clear element in the COVID-19 emergency has been that it has been possible to develop vaccines in not in 10 years, but in 10 months, although subject to emergency approval, as we know. But it has been a major achievement from a scientific point of view, although it was mentioned in the webinar, we have no achievement in terms of distribution of the vaccines, but a situation which is really painful, as it was mentioned. Another element that has been shown in the case of COVID-19 is the major role that states, governments have played in supporting the industry. This was also present in COVID-19, but as we know, governments, such as in the case of the United States or also in Europe, have provided massive subsidies to the companies. In the case of the United States, $10.5 billion US, in order to develop the vaccines, in accordance to some reports, up to 97% of the development cost of vaccines by Western companies were actually covered by government subsidies and also some subsidies by charities. So important. So it's quite clear that the support of the governments have played a significant role in the COVID-19 context. There is also a lesson from this COVID-19 emergency about profitability. So this situation seems to confirm what Professor Shadlen thought at the time, that the vaccine industry, like many people think, is profitable, as we can see if we look at the huge profits made by Pfizer, for instance. But also this COVID-19 crisis has shown the emergence of new competitors, of new producers. Well, Moderna, of course, is one clear example. But we have also Bharat in India, which has recently got approval from the World Health Organization on the basis of emergency again. We have now China as an important producer of vaccines. The first,
Dr. Correa?
Yes?
Dr. Correa, sorry to interrupt you. I just would like you to wrap up very quickly if you can,
okay, yeah,
so
yeah.
we can keep things moving. Thank you.
Just 2 minutes. So you have Russia, you have Cuba also, who has produced a couple of vaccines, and therefore the landscape for the vaccine industry in the future may be different. So COVID-19 may bring about a significant change in the structure of the vaccine industry. So we don't know still to what extent, and the extent to which it will bring more competition, and then the oligopolistic characteristic of the industry may be actually overcome. So finally, just one word about the role of developing countries. Some of the vaccines now being used have come from developing countries, so they have shown the capacity to enter into this field. In particular, has been the case of China, of Cuba, as I mentioned, also of India. In Africa, there is a number of initiatives in order to increase significantly the production of vaccines. So very important initiatives are taking place there because of the overdependence of the continent. So I think that developing countries have already played some role, as is clear with the Serum Institute in India, but they may play a more important role in the vaccine production in the future. Well, thank you very much, and sorry if I took too long.
No, that was wonderful, Dr. Correa. Thank you so much. So next up, we have Ken Shadlin. Ken is a professor in development studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So great to have you, Professor Shadlin.
Great, thanks for having me. I might be one of the few non-lawyers actually here. Thanks just to the organizers for putting this together and including me, all the presenters, the audience. I'm particularly impressed by those of you in East Asia, where it's now well into your Saturday night. It's been a great 2 days. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, even if you're just Zoom squares, rather than actually seeing you in person. I'm going to start with a broad remark, and then I'm quickly going to get into the weeds about vaccine production in contemporary Latin America, particularly COVID-19 vaccine production in contemporary Latin America. And my starting remark is that my sense is that there's been substantially more technology transfer and partnerships around the globe than most people acknowledge. There hasn't been enough, or as much as we'd like there to be, but I often hear this, they won't transfer their technology or they won't share. And I think that's sort of overcooking things or overstating things. So if you look at sort of the data that Airfinity provides, where they track manufacturing and production deals around the globe, they have 331 of them recorded, of which about 68% of those are what they call either technology or technology and fill and finish. So not just sole fill and finish. And that counts again for about 68% of them. Of that 68%, so of the 225 agreements that are technology or technology and fill and finish, about a quarter of those are outside of the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, sort of in the global south, you want to call it that. I don't know whether having a quarter of that, roughly 60 or so, is a lot or a little. And I think that's something that's worth discussing. I just think it's an interesting, and I also don't know how much that compares to normal times, but I think those are questions we need to ask ourselves. Now, for me, the pressing sort of empirical research challenge is trying to understand this variation, why we've seen the partnerships that we've seen, why some originators have been much more interested and involved in doing this than others, which local firms have been involved as partners, and so on. And that's sort of where my research is right now and my head is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to present sort of and assess as quickly as I can sort of the vaccine production landscape in Latin America and the Caribbean, and make some general remarks along the way. All of this is very much in sort of an exploratory, sort of works in progress sort of way. So what I want to do is just share this chart, which I'm going to make full screen. I assume everybody can see this. If you can't, somebody will shout at me and you can't see this. So what I've done here is I've divided these up by the technology platforms. Of the 4 main technology platforms, you'll see that one is missing. I'm not going to go through this in detail. If I did, it would take well more than 15 minutes. You could see some sort of summary remarks in the light blue, sort of near the bottom. There are 12 different partnerships in the region. They are at very different stages. There's 13 firms involved, but because 3 of these are so ambiguous, I don't know whether it's, so there's 3 public firms, 7 private firms, and there's 3 that are so ambiguous. There's one in Peru and there's one in Chile that have so little details. And there's another one in Argentina that has so little details that that's why I say 3 firms to be determined, and it includes 3 or 5 countries. As I said, it's 3 different technological platforms. You could see the 6 different vaccines that are there on the top part of the slide, and I'm going to come back to this. And it's mostly fill and finish in the region. There are 2 cases of producing sort of the antigen. Some people call it the antigen, some people call it the API, which isn't technically right in vaccines. One of those is in Brazil, and one of those is in Argentina, and I'll talk about those in a moment. I'm not talking much here about the homegrown vaccine projects, of which those exist too, particularly in the 4 countries there at the bottom: Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and Mexico. The Cuban projects appear to be the most advanced. Clinical trial results have been announced. I don't think the data have been published yet. Maybe they have in some of them. There's some production issues here, partially because of the Cubans' inability to produce a lot of these on their own, partially because they don't typically produce vaccines for the world, and partially because of the US embargo, which hurts. There's also an issue in that some of them, not all of them, are triple dose vaccines, which of course means you need even more. So constrained production plus needing a lot more. But I want to talk about the stuff in the top half of the slide. So, and I'm going to go through these by technology platform. Where most of the action has been in the viral vector space, particularly the 2 sort of with AstraZeneca that are producing. One of these is Biomanguinhos, which is a public laboratory in Rio, linked to the Ministry of Health. And the other one is a private firm called Mob Science, which is in Buenos Aires. And then that second one is an interesting collaboration because they just do the antigen and then they ship it off. And another firm in Mexico does the fill and finish. So the Argentinians aren't solely doing the production. They could actually, but the way this was set up between AstraZeneca and the external funder of this, which I'll talk in a little bit, brought Mexico into it. But that's actually, so this company, Mob Science in Argentina, is the only place in the region that's actually producing the antigen, the API right now, because even in Brazil, where it was in 2 stages, they're just moving to full production now. I mean, literally just moving to it now. And the output of that right now that I've seen is actually still non-existent. Then there's a lot, but there's a lot from Russia as well, the Sputnik vaccine. But this is almost all fill and finish, with one exception of a private Brazilian company that has plans for technology transfer and antigen production, but it's not there yet. The point is that this builds on the biologics manufacturing capabilities in the region. And I think the key thing that I want to drive home here is that there probably could be more, because there are plenty of other biosimilar producers in the region. There are more than just a handful of, really just 2 that are doing the antigen, maybe 3 with União Química in Brazil. There are more biosimilar producers in the region. And the other thing I want to point out here before moving on, and while time is flying, is that there's a big missing actor here, which is Johnson & Johnson, which had the viral vector vaccine that was supposed to save the world because it was a single shot and easily transportable and so on and so forth. And I find it to be really shocking and disappointing, to be normative, that there's no Johnson & Johnson collaboration with anywhere in the region. If you move to the sort of the traditional inactivated approach, this is where the Chinese firms are most involved, 1 private and 1 public. But here I think it's striking that there's so little action outside of Brazil. So in Brazil, there's with a public lab, it's a 2-stage thing where they're starting with the importing it and doing the local fill and finish, and they're planning on moving into full production later. That's supposed to happen in 2022 in a new facility that's being built in Sao Paulo. There's talk about another Sinovac agreement in Chile, but there's no details. There's talk about a Sinopharm agreement in Argentina, but no details. It's striking how little there is. And I think that, with all of the attention that goes to the reticence of the Pfizers and the Modernas and the Western companies to sort of build production networks and share and transfer their technology and partner, I think we need more research into what the Chinese and basically the other non-US European companies are doing as well. With regard to the mRNA technology, which of course is the hot topic that everyone's excited about, this is just appearing. As everybody knows, Pfizer made an agreement with Europharma, a private Brazilian firm, for fill and finish. They announced this in late August, around the same time that they announced a similar scheme with partners in South Africa, if I have my dates right. There's no Moderna, which won't surprise anybody on this call. Moderna has been beaten up well over the course of the last 2 days. They just don't seem to be interested in doing this. I mean, one thing everybody should know is that Moderna has produced about 25% of the vaccines that either Pfizer or AstraZeneca or Sinovac have produced. So Moderna doesn't transfer widely. They don't They don't license widely, they don't play widely, and outside of the US, they don't vaccinate widely. They're making a lot of money, but they're not producing a lot. That's been their strategy, evidently. PAHO is, as announced, an mRNA hub that's similar to the one that the WHO announced in South Africa. It's based on the companies in Argentina and the company in Brazil. Interestingly, the Mexican company that's involved in the AstraZeneca collaboration is not part of this. They're not included. But the big, and I can come back to that in a minute. I think the reason why is that the only reason why the Mexican company was included in the first place was that some of the financing came from the Carlos Slim Foundation. But the big problem here is similar to the South Africa WHO one, is for a hub to work, it needs an external supplier. And right now there isn't an external technology supplier. So this summarizes what I basically said, and just adding that the other big fourth platform of adjuvenated protein, which is something that also would build on biologic capabilities in the region, and is also a known technology that there's plenty of vaccine producers in the region that could do. There's none of this in Latin America. There are no agreements with Novavax, no agreements with Sanofi, GSK, which are the ones that are sort of in the pipeline about to come out. So let me just say, I want to say a couple of quick words about the ones that have gone the furthest, and the ones that include full vaccine production of the antigen or the API, which are the AstraZeneca collaborations. Both of these investments were made at risk, meaning that the companies were putting money down to start building facilities and hiring and getting ready to go before the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved, when it was still in trials. The funding came from public sources, meaning the governments, but it also came from private sources, the Lehman Foundation in Brazil, the Carlos Slim Foundation in the Argentina-Mexico one. Neither of these are what you would call sort of independent production. They are part of the AstraZeneca supply chain. I think one of the things I think is interesting here is that if you sort of why the companies are involved in these, other than the fact that they're trying to produce vaccines to save the world. In the Brazilian one, it's about capability enhancement. I mean, they hadn't produced a viral vector vaccine, and it took them a lot of work to learn it, which is why they're further behind. For the Argentinian one, this is not a vaccine producer either, they're a biosimilars producer. But this was actually fairly easy for them to learn, again, with technology transfer from AstraZeneca. But they were much further ahead and able to do this much more quickly. But for them, I think it's more of commercial opportunities. And I think you're going to see, as sort of in biologics that are launched by AstraZeneca in the region, many more sort of tie-ups between the Argentinian firm Science and AstraZeneca. And I think this is quite important, because I do think we have to, for all the talk about the technology transfer on the shipping out side, we have to look at sort of what is it on the recipient side that these guys are looking for, what they want to get out of it. The promise of full production, I think, is well known here. It reduces vulnerability. Fill and finish alone depends on the ability to get the input. So that's what happened in Brazil. AstraZeneca stopped sending the Brazilians the API that was supposed to come from China, presumably because they sent it to Europe instead, and that held up the Brazilian production. And from the flip side of Argentina, that was all delayed because the Mexicans weren't really able to produce, weren't really able to do the fill finish. And in fact, the original fill finishing that was done of those was done in the US, because AstraZeneca got tired of waiting for the Mexican company to get its act together and had them being fill finished by a contract manufacturer in the US. Eventually, the Mexicans got online. But in both cases, you're vulnerable, you're dependent on your partner, either the upstream supplier or the downstream fill and finisher. There is no full production in the region yet. As I said a moment ago, Biomanguinhos in Rio is just starting to do this. And as I've said a number of times now, the Science is not full production because it wasn't arranged as full production. It could be, they could do it, or they have a partner company right down the street that could do it. But it's the way it was set up with the agreement with AstraZeneca and the Slim Foundation has it being done in 2 countries. I think that's a very interesting story, which we can come back to. But looking at the clock, I'm not going to come back to it now. So my last point is this larger question, sort of stepping out of the weeds a little bit, is to what extent COVID-19 might act as a trigger for health-related or health industrial policies. And the sort of the key point here is I think that everybody is realizing around the globe, not just in Latin America, but in much of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa as well, that health vulnerabilities are rooted in industrial weaknesses. Again, it's not a new problem. The recognition of it isn't new, but I think we're seeing it much more vividly and widely now. This statement, our health vulnerabilities are rooted in the weakness of our pharmaceutical sector, or the origins of what's called the health industrial complex, CIS in Portuguese, in Brazil, which was introduced about 10 or 12 years ago in the second Lula government. The Argentinian government now seems to be obsessed with it. The Ministry of Production basically mapped out the entire pharmaceutical industry to see who are the people here that can produce vaccines. Clearly, it's not just this one country mob science. I think they've come up with 8 biosimilars producers that could be involved. City of Bogota is doing something similar. More generally, there are opportunities here for policy interventions to sort of address the pharmaceutical industrial weaknesses to reduce the health vulnerabilities. And this is a big topic of the Pan American Health Organization. It always has been, but particularly in the last few months, they've sort of taken this up sort of orders of magnitude to higher levels. And I'll just end it there. It's not just about vaccines, it's also about the rest of the sort of panoply of countermeasures and medical technologies we care about. But importantly, it's not just for this pandemic, but it's for going forward as well. And at 45 seconds over time, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shadlin. So last but not least, we have one of the most prolific and influential scholars of international intellectual property. We're so glad to have Peter Yu with us. So Peter is Regents Professor of Law and Communication and the Director of the Center for Law and Intellectual Property at the Texas A&M University School of Law. Professor Yu, you get the last say, well, before the Q&A.
Thank you, Madhavi. So let me start by thanking both Madhavi and Hao Ching for this wonderful conference. It's one of the best IP and COVID conferences I've been to in the last few years. So congratulations. I also want to thank those of you guys who are in Hong Kong, who are staying past midnight for this conference. I wish I can be back home with you guys. So I've been asked to talk about the China's changing landscape in light of the pandemic. So I think it'll be a good idea to use the waiver that Jerry and others have heavily criticized as an illustration of the changing landscape in China. I'm not going to have time to talk about the pros and cons or what I think about a waiver, but for those who are curious, I have a paper online and you can get it from there. So if you look at the China's reaction to COVID in the TRIPS Council, China is actually quite supportive. So China currently is not a co-sponsor of the proposal. And obviously the proponents are India and South Africa. But China is very supportive. And I think it's a good contrast when you look at the position taken by Brazil when India and South Africa proposed the waiver. And Brazil is actually against the waiver and believes that it might hurt innovators as well. And so I think that's a quite interesting contrast, especially when you think about the leaders in the developing world. In the chapter I'm going to do for the book, I'll probably be able to get into COVAX, but for this presentation and with the limited time, I will not be able to do that. So the first question or the big question I want to address here in presentation is, why did China take a somewhat different position than some of the other developing countries? So I'm going to offer you 3 sets of explanation. The first set is relating to the changing IP landscape within China. Since the mid-2000s, China has been actively developing what some has considered as indigenous innovation, and I usually describe it as independent innovation, because it's not dependent on whether innovation is homegrown. It can also be acquired abroad. But regardless, the development in China with respect to intellectual property in the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s after China joined the WTO is very different from the mid-2000s and what we have in the past decade. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind. China has also been very active in the patent development. So based on WIPO statistics, China is currently #1 in terms of the international applications through the PCT, the Patent Cooperation Treaty. You can actually debate about whether China is to be #1, #3, #4, or number 10. But regardless, that is very different from what we have had more than a decade ago. The Global Innovation Index has been released in September, put China as number 12, and it moves up from 14 in the last 2 years. You can also debate where China is in the index, but at the same time, that shows that China is actually very actively focusing on innovation as opposed to just using IP and going for the more development efforts. And China has also a lot of changes within the pharmaceutical landscape. So the latest amendment to the patent law, which was adopted last year, and we just entered into effect this summer, it has extended patent terms similar to what we have in the US for the Hatch-Waxman extension due to regulatory delay. China has also introduced a new patent linkage system that ties marketing approval to patent status. That also comes out from the new amendment. And in the proposed measures for test data protection, China has 6 years for drugs, basically chemical drugs, and then 12 years for biologics. With respect to 6 years for chemical drugs, that's actually not that surprising, considering that China has already agreed to it when China joined the WTO. But with respect to biologics, it's actually quite surprising, even for me, because China is basically have the same standard, proposing the same standard as the US. And that is higher than than all the free trade agreements we have seen, whether you are talking about TPP, LCEP, USMCA, and all those. And I think that is actually quite interesting. And China has also been very active in focusing on healthcare AI. And so I saw some questions earlier about AI in the Q&A platform, and you can see that China has also been very active. So if you go back to the earlier slide right there, China is basically number 2 right there, just below the US. And this is the distribution of different products and technologies that China has focused on. In September, China actually released an outline on how to build a powerful IP nation. And that's basically a 15-year plan. And that's quite interesting in terms of how China wants to position itself in the IP and innovation debate. And so that raises a lot of questions about how what role China will play with respect to the North-South divide, whether China will still be the leader that people expect for a developing world, or is China moving actually closer to the position taken by the US, EU, Japan, as well as other developed countries. And a very interesting discussion is also relating to some of the panelists earlier, is that what position will China take? Is China getting further and further away from what India has been taking? Traditionally, we think about China, India, and Brazil as the leaders of the developing world within WTO, as well as other international organizations. But in terms of pharmaceuticals, based on what I showed you guys earlier here in the presentation, it seems like that China is actually moving further and further away from a position taken by India. So the second set of explanation I want to share with you is relating to international relations. So a lot of newspaper articles, as well as other media, have been talking about the wolf warrior mentality, taken from one of the very successful movie in China. And so when you think about why China doesn't actually go out of the way to be at the forefront of debate on the waiver, as well as COVAX and others, keep in mind that China actually joined COVAX a few months later than other countries, right? So that's actually something for us to think about. And so one historical response will be that, well, China has always wanted to keep low profile at the international level, and that can trace back all the way from the advice from Deng Xiaoping, talk about how we actually need to consider our capabilities. It's actually not the easiest translation with Tao Guang Yanhui, but at the same time, that will give you some idea about what's going on over there. So when we think about a different engagement with international norms in China, I think this is a framework I usually use. We don't have non-breaker anymore in part because of both the WTO as well as the changing landscape in China for both IP and innovation. But the interesting question here is why China would rather stay at the second level or the third level as opposed to going further to be at the forefront of the debate on pandemic responses. As much as I would like to go back to the historical development, we also need to keep in mind that China's position is also changing in terms of assertiveness. A lot of us in the US have been following what's going on in Alaska. And I think that is a very good example of how China has become more and more assertive. And so that's actually not the best explanation about why China is keeping more of a low profile with respect to this debate. And my suggestion is actually that China has a lot of self-interest in terms of why it would be a good position for China to take. One of them obviously is because of all the problems and struggle that China has with respect to a lot of the people who are actually affected by the pandemic. And so I think it's a very good example. Another example is with respect to attention that people are paying to regarding the origin of the virus. And so there's no good reason for China to actually get off the way to be at the forefront of the debate, especially in light of the substantial scrutiny from both the media as well as other governments. At the intellectual property level, China was also involved in some of the dispute with the US as well as EU. Here on the slide, I show you the WTO complaint that's been filed by the US during the last administration, and that one was only filed a few years ago. And there's still ongoing complaint from the EU with respect to similar issue. To the extent we are talking about a wafer or transfer of technology, we actually get into issues about forced technology transfer with respect to both disputes. So the whack-a-mole slide right here is actually a very good example. Why, in light of all the problems, why do you want to actually put your head out there so that people can actually hit on you? And so I think it's a very good way to capture what China has been doing. But another way that we can actually capture about what China has been doing is what I refer to as strategic deference. So if you look at how China has been negotiating out of the international agreements, I think RCEP is a very good example. China did not offer any proposal. We got it from Japan, South Korea, India, and ASEAN, but not China, not Australia, not New Zealand. And I think there are a few items that China actually is very eager to include in the RCEP negotiations. Article 26 with respect to the disclosure requirement in the patent law is a very good example. But China doesn't need to do that because India has already floated a proposal on genetic resources, TK, and folklore with 10 paragraphs for the RCEP negotiation draft. And so China can actually just take advantage of the fact that others have been offering proposals and preserve a lot of the political capital that can be spent elsewhere. And the last set of explanation I want to share with you is about vaccine diplomacy. Vaccine diplomacy is something that China has paid a lot of attention to in light of how it can actually improve the soft power with respect to the country. So when you think about vaccine diplomacy or what to do with vaccine in foreign countries, you can go for the waiver, or you can go for donations, which China has been actively doing. There are also other options too. So Jerry talked about the proposal on regional supply center that he and Fred Abbott has proposed recently, as well as more than a decade ago in a different context. Geoffrey talks about the effort with respect to a new development bank. Right, there are a lot of choices with respect to what countries can take with respect to the foreign policy. So I think China is actually hedging in terms of position, as well as hedging the risk of taking a wrong position. And so this is actually quite attractive with respect to pandemic responses, because a lot of them are actually not mutually exclusive. You can actually go with both the waiver as well as some of the other policy that we discussed earlier on. So what I want to end in the interest of time is about how to think about the debate going forward. So I want to share with you 3 observations. The first one is with respect to developing countries. So here on the slide, I include only the BRICS countries, but this is actually quite interesting and illustrative as well. India and South Africa are the proponents of the waiver. China is supportive. Brazil is against the waiver. And Russia, which also joined China and the US by not supporting COVAX in the very beginning, is the only country that's issued a compulsory license during the pandemic. Hungary and Israel are the only other 2 countries that have issued a compulsory licensing. So even within the BRICS countries or the emerging countries, you can see that there's a deep divide with respect to the position they're going to take. So the second observation I want to share with you is about the different side deals that have been going on in Geneva in the run-up to the ministerial. a lot of those ideas are not relating to intellectual property. So there's a big question as to what role China will play and how that will play out. And there's already been some discussion among some of the member states as well as the NGO community about how countries need to finish the negotiation on the waiver before the ministerial. Otherwise, it will be complicated with respect to other concessions at the WTO. And the last observation I want to end on is about the fact that, well, if we are trying to hash out a deal during the ministerial, we could end up with something that's actually quite bad. And so the big question for the proponents and co-sponsors of the waiver is where they're going to take it. Do you go for no deal or do you go for a bad deal? And I suspect here, China will also not be very active in terms of taking a position one way or another, because as I mentioned earlier on, China has been hedging the risk of the different policies. And so I don't think China will take actually a major role with respect to that particular debate. And so on that note, I'll stop here and pass it back to Madhavi.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was fantastic. I'm going to jump right into questions. We're going to start with Kashish Aneja. And so Calvin Ho, one of our other participants, asks you to talk a little bit more about India's own vaccine diplomacy with respect to its homegrown vaccine in particular. And you mentioned, I believe, a turn finally to use of compulsory licensing within India. Could you talk a little bit more about that, but then also to what extent may we be seeing India involved in technology transfer and perhaps even modeling some of these things like inviting apprentices from other potential regional hubs that could be being developed, but bringing in apprentices through the WHO to watch some and learn from its own technology. So what do you see there in terms of the range of vaccine diplomacy that India might already be engaged in, but could be engaged in?
Thanks, Madhavi. So as Calvin mentioned, and as Peter has also mentioned, vaccine diplomacy has been at the center of the entire pandemic vaccine response in the past year. I mean, India played a very critical role in terms of vaccine diplomacy during a phase of January till March this year, at a point when we had not yet witnessed a second wave of the pandemic, and it was like the amount of vaccines which are being exported were almost close to the amount of vaccines which were being used in the country during those 3 months. So India, there had been some tensions between India and China in terms of vaccine diplomacy, trying to cover as much of the South and the Southeast Asian region as possible. But after March, because of the crisis in India had to stop its exports, and hence the vaccine diplomacy was at a pause over there. But I think from last month itself, with exports continuing in the region to Iran, Bangladesh, Myanmar, I think vaccine diplomacy is back on the table with India and the region, and we're going to see much of it in the coming couple of months. And your suggestion about the tech transfer is absolutely right. I think India is going to be much more active in terms of its domestic vaccine, especially because Covaxin, which is produced by Bharat Biotech, it has just recently last week received the EUA from the WHO, which took considerable time. But now that they have that, I think countries would be much more comfortable accepting that. And that might be one of their key tools for the vaccine diplomacy moving forward. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we need to keep on them with this idea. And that actually makes me turn to Dr. Correa. So one of our participants in the audience, Sunimal Mendes, asks, what do you think are the prospects for citizens in developed countries like Canada, for example, to be more involved, pressing their own right to health by putting pressure on the government to issue compulsory licenses to produce vaccines for export to low-income countries? And just on that question too, to follow it up, the role of civil society. I mean, is this all just too complicated for a citizen movement on the ground to push for more activity to get vaccines made for export to low-income countries? So thank you so much, Dr. Correa.
Well, no, it's not so complicated. I would say civil society has been very active. Many NGOs have produced letters sent to for instance, to the US government, and maybe this was influential in the change of the US in relation to the waiver, which is being negotiated in WTO. So civil society has played in the COVID-19 crisis an important role, may continue to play. In the case of Canada, certainly it will be very important to keep that going on, because so far, as you know, there is a specific request from Bolivia to get supplies of vaccines from a Canadian company, which has been unable so far to get a compulsory license under the Canadian law. So civil society, as it was the case for HIV/AIDS crisis, so civil society changed the way in which governments were looking at that. So it's really very important. And I hope civil society will continue to work on this in order to move governments to make the right decisions which are needed.
Thank you. Professor Shadlin, thank you for directing us toward J&J and also AstraZeneca, not just focusing on Moderna as we have been doing. With respect to AstraZeneca, I think really more needs to be written, as you're suggesting, about that particular about how we actually can see a model for tech transfer there, where we see the contracts from Oxford University in particular pushing and requiring sharing with low-income countries from the get-go. So could you maybe talk us through a little bit about some of the ways in which that was a model, and also ways, I know it's also been highly criticized. So some of the things we could learn from what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the problem is that there's so little that we actually know because we don't get to see most of the documents, and that's sort of the common denominator in all of this. But remember that AstraZeneca is not a traditional vaccine producer. So Carlos Correa in his presentation talked about how prior to COVID, the vaccine market was a handful of companies. AstraZeneca wasn't one of those. And so it needed to find partners. It doesn't have its own vaccine production. And given that Oxford required that this was going to be sold basically at cost, AstraZeneca needed to find partners that weren't its own production facilities, because it needed to use its own production facilities to make its own drugs, that it wasn't going to sell at cost. There would be huge opportunity costs for AstraZeneca. So I think it was a combination of Oxford's requirement that this was going to be done at cost, and the fact then that given AstraZeneca's position in the pharmaceutical market and its own capabilities, it was going to have to build a very distributed global network of production. Compare that to Pfizer. Pfizer can use its own facilities. And if you look at basically Pfizer's production network, it's Pfizer in Belgium and Pfizer here and Pfizer there, because they have the facilities and they're selling it at a for-profit price. And so I think that there's a lot of, those are some of the factors that are involved. And again, the big question is why Johnson & Johnson didn't pursue that same route, because it's the same technological platform. So any company that could make the AstraZeneca vaccine or the Sputnik vaccine or CanSino, which is the other viral vector vaccine that's out there, could also make the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And why Johnson & Johnson has pursued such a different strategy, I don't have the answer to that, but hopefully I will at some point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Last question goes to Professor Yu, and this is from my co-convener, Professor Sun. So he's asking, how do we deal with vaccine nationalism? So China still has not recognized the mRNA vaccines. What are your thoughts there?
So Hakim, this is a very good question. I think all countries want to focus on their citizens, first of all, and I don't think that's actually that surprising. But with respect to vaccine nationalism, I actually do not see that as local protectionism. I think the question is suggested with respect to mRNA seems to be that China is trying to favor local companies. I think China is trying to increase the leverage so that it can actually develop the pandemic policy a little bit better in light of the different technologies that have been deployed by different companies, especially in the West. And so I think you probably have nationalism in that direction but less so about the traditional local protectionism favoring the local companies. But at the same time, I also don't think that that would stay for too long, because China actually has a very active approach and engagement in terms of vaccine diplomacy, as we discussed earlier. And I think China is very eager to actually increase the capacity so that it can reach out to other places. I think Ken already mentioned some development with respect to Sinovac. That's unclear. But at the same time, I think China is very eager to do that. And all the efforts with respect to vaccine diplomacy will actually cut down on the vaccine nationalism concerns that people have. I will also add that I think I see that in the Q&A earlier, asking me about the recent changes to patent law. And this a little bit outside the context, so I will not directly address that. But I want to point out a few things that are quite important with respect to the pandemic. The first one is that there are some pandemic responses about extension that was actually included in the amendment. So that's quite interesting. The other one is about open access, and that can also be quite attractive if you look at the latest amendment to your patent law. And the last one, which is more broadly covering a lot of the parties to the LCP, is that the LCP has actually built into any subsequent waiver adopted at the international level. And so to the extent that the waiver can get adopted, we also have a mechanism within the agreement to actually get it extended to other parties to that agreement.
Professor Yu, let me follow up with the same question that I asked Kashish and Aneja in terms of thinking about vaccine diplomacy. Which will be the first country to consider tech transfer as a central part of their vaccine diplomacy? So not just donating doses, but really sharing the critical technology that's homegrown. What are the prospects for China doing more of that?
I think the prospects are actually quite good. In light of the effort that China has been doing with respect to a Belt and Road Initiative, I think there has been a lot of concern with respect to what's going on with the initiative. And so I think this is actually a good opportunity. If I have my opportunity to actually offer any advice, I actually believe that helping to set up regional supply center as part of the Belt and Road Initiative is actually a good way to do it. And so if the country is going in that direction, I think the diplomacy will go more into tech transfer as opposed to just donating vaccines.
Thank you. So this has been a phenomenal set of conversations and presentations with great ideas and really tough questions that you've all been asking. I want to give a hearty thanks to our preeminent speakers that gathered with us here for 2 days, not just for your panels, but you really stuck with us throughout all the various conversations, and we're grateful for that. And thank you to our engaged audience, many of whom are with us late into the night on this weekend. We're grateful for the creative problem-solving approach that's been taken by each of our intellectual leaders here, and who gathered here yesterday and today. And we look forward to publish your important contributions in a volume soon. I want to also finally again thank our staff who helped support this meeting from Georgetown Law and Hong Kong University. And on behalf of my co-convener, Professor Sun, who's here joining us, and all of the participants, we want to just wish you a good remainder of your weekend. And we hope very much, most of all, to see these conversations not just push forward scholarship as we're committed to doing, but to see these conversations galvanize action in the coming weeks and months, and of course, well beyond that as well. So thank you so much, everybody. I wish we could also have a celebratory gathering of just the conference participants in person, as you also deserve for your wonderful contributions. But we'll leave that one for another day for the in-person one. But thank you so much.